You wanted real talk, and this is where you'll hear it. Uninhibited by the toxic influences of cancel culture, unvarnished and unfettered, unencumbered by the censorship of traditional radio, uncontaminated by big media interests.
And now, Sherman Unlimited.
You may have noticed I've been absent for a bit longer than usual. Well, like you, I've been trying very hard to understand how our country became the focus of the world and often the laughingstock of it over what we're told amounts to a few hundred truckers parked in the wrong parts of Ottawa. Generally, that would be covered by local police tapping on the cab windows and saying, "Excuse me, sir, you're parked illegally, move along." And if you say no, well, then they call for backup and you're cuffed and you're arrested and your vehicle is towed. Well, that's pretty simplistic, but you know that by now. Could they have moved them earlier? Of course they could. So what really happened here? Well, it's not simply about Ottawa, and it's not just about trucks or truckers. It's not even just about some on-again, off-again protests at various Canada-U.S. border points and bridges. I fear this was so much more than that, but have nothing concrete by way of proof to tell you anything about it. I hesitate to unpack a story that some would label a fairy tale, so I'll talk to you about what I do know, and I'll speculate on what I saw. What I know, and what we all know now, is that for most of a month, there has been civil unrest in Canada. We've seen worse. This issue centered mostly and unsurprisingly on Ontario, though some of the same protest groups tested the mettle of law enforcement in Manitoba, BC, and Alberta. This arrived on the scene by way of something called the Freedom Convoy. It appeared to be a growing protest by working people that pertained to limits being placed on them by the federal government, saying they could only drive their trucks back into Canada under rules governing unvaxxed people, which currently say that you have to quarantine for 14 days under such circumstances. It quickly became a lot more based on a lot less. By that I mean that we came to realize that a vast majority of the protesting truckers were already vaccinated, as many some say as 90%. And so we wondered what the issues really were, indeed what they are. It's a pretty serious thing to drive a Mack tractor with a monster diesel engine and wheels almost as high as a human being from British Columbia or PEI to Ottawa just to tell the federal government that you aren't happy. Well, most of us don't have trucks, and most of us are now vaccinated. But many of us, nevertheless, cheered them on because the real statement being made was, look, we've had just about enough of your authoritarian bullshit. And when I say authoritarian, this is a polite word to describe what was really happening in Canada. Anyway, the message is about authoritarian imposition of rules and regulations that many or most of us just don't want any longer. We take our cue from jurisdictions around the world that have done away with a lot or even all of the restrictions because, for now at least, COVID is not a huge issue. So the truckers' protests were about speaking truth to power. Is that wrong? Because our Constitution says it's fine. And you could even argue encouraged. And so is telling the Prime Minister he's just incorrect if he considers this to be an insurrection. But I do think the big rigs and the smaller ones had worn out their welcome and had made their point. The concept of forcible removal, however, did not require the invoking of the Emergencies Act. So why was it invoked? I believed, and I do believe, the protest initially had a solid message, and many of us praised these people for taking it to the government, to Prime Minister Trudeau specifically, to in effect speak on our behalf, our, as in we, the people. We probably, most of us, thought the message would be delivered loud and clear, that we'd see some movement, and that all of these folks would get back quickly to hauling our groceries and goods and spending many nights sleeping at home in their own beds in their cities and towns across the country. The nonsense of Confederate flags or one Confederate flag and a few nut bars flying swastikas was a distraction. Not sure who did that, but it was highly unlikely to have been the mainstream demonstrators. Bad apples, probably. False flags? Maybe. In Canada, we are understated compared to almost anywhere else on the planet. We don't have a history of confrontation, and we don't have a history of authoritarian governments either, much less tree-hugging liberal ones. Most Canucks believe in the CBC, for God's sakes, and would say I'm the crazy one for calling it the government's paid mouthpiece. But as I speak to you, I sit 2,500 100 kilometers south, and watched firsthand how non-Canadian media were talking about us, and it hasn't been pleasant discourse. I received phone calls from American friends asking what in the hell is going on up there, and I had no fulsome answers. I even got a call from a friend late of Montreal, now resident in the southern United States, who sounded gobsmacked that he was looking at his home and native land on the various news channels portrayed in quite unfavorable terms. He thought and said that usually it played out in reverse. Our news media is ostensibly free. There is no threat of imprisonment for writing an opinion piece in a newspaper or for publishing facts you've uncovered on a TV network or on radio. And as of today, anyone like me can have a podcast. People can listen to it, agree with it, reject it, or they can choose not to listen to it at all. But conventional media have had a hard time adjusting to the revolution brought on by massive societal change that makes them less relevant and therefore less profitable. The government of Justin Trudeau, suggesting it wants to preserve a healthy media environment, has provided public subsidies to a variety of media over several years, and it begs the question of how far they can go before someone decides that such an arrangement buys perspective. So the suggestion is that there's a corollary. It is just the thought that if you want to keep your media business alive, maybe don't be too vocal in criticizing government action. The world is full of countries that run like that, and I choose not to live in any. I choose to live in Canada. Meanwhile, the slide of conventional media continues, and many people flock to social media for their news, coming away with opinions formed from those inputs. They're not always right, but neither is the CBC, which gets all its funding from the government, save for a little commercial revenue on the TV side only. So I am asked frequently what I know about where the Emergency Act came from, why Trudeau seems to be seeking an awful lot of power and control to resolve what came across as a relatively small problem. We didn't see it used to keep people from blocking pipelines or railways. What was different now? There are many stories circulating, indeed, have been circulating for the last several years. One of them has to do with what Trudeau believes the future should look like in a world that is going to be built back better, a phrase he chooses to use often. Others use another phrase you've heard, the Great Reset. All of this sounds benign. Is it? Truthfully, I don't know, but it makes me uneasy. I take no responsibility for the origination of any of it, but like many of you, I hear a lot of this stuff, and I believe two things. First, where there's smoke, there's fire, and second, you can't make this shit up. Trudeau appears to believe that he is on a mission to rewrite the operating instructions for the entire world, along with a small number of others in high places who think our destiny is about what they do. First, ask yourself if you want the way the world works to be rewritten, and if so, would you send Trudeau as your representative? The truckers were in Ottawa and elsewhere to send a message. Other people in other places around the world have been mounting similar efforts. I think over the next period of time, things will subside, but to coin a phrase, don't be surprised if the same folks don't take much broader and harsher action in order to enhance their effort and build back better. Here's what Justin Trudeau has not understood. Despite abrogating them for some purpose which can hardly be related to truckers camped out on Ottawa streets, he trampled on basic Canadian rights. And our freedoms as well. Our rights in the broadest collective sense. Forget about the truckers. As I mentioned, moving them off the streets of Ottawa was never anything beyond a police action at the local level anyway. What we have to be asking ourselves is why an act as broad and punishing as the Emergencies Act was invoked for this purpose in the first place. The Emergencies Act replaced the War Measures Act, an even tougher piece of legislation used only twice in wartime and only once outside of wartime, and that was in 1970 when Justin Trudeau's father invoked it to help quell a festering and unsettling situation in Quebec, involving the use of terrorist tactics to move that province towards separation. It was said to be overkill at the time, but as one who covered that period as a reporter in Montreal, I would say that Trudeau the Elder had no other tools in his kit and actually did need a visible military presence and the denial of some rights to accomplish what was required. And he succeeded then, and he packed up the War Measures Act forever. We have no threat to the country that anyone I know can identify. We have a prime minister who fancies himself a king, and he has the ongoing and thoughtless support of another party whose leader literally staggers blindly in the dark, grabbing at Trudeau's coattails to support whatever Trudeau and his minority government want. Can you imagine anything more ridiculous than the two highly progressive left-of-center parties behaving the way they do when it's they that purport to be the guardians of the common man? The common man and woman want to get out of jail right now. There has been no other country with so many restrictions in the name of COVID-19 for as long as the ones we've lived under in Canada. No, cry some. Oh, I'm immunocompromised, say others. And then there's, I'm just afraid of COVID, another rallying cry. I say, stop it. You embarrass yourselves. No one has said that you cannot take reasonable precautions on your own without being told by the government what you must do. We did not and never have elected people to hold our hands and guide us through life. I'm in Florida now as I record this. Oh, Florida, you say. Well, that's been a disaster, hasn't it? Many Canadians do say that. But no, actually, it's been and still is quite nice. The weather has always attracted Canadians, and this year we have the full complement of Canadians. Yes, at 1.5 times the population of Ontario, plus a few more million snowbird visitors, and in a landmass that's 1/10 the size of Ontario, there are some 25 million here, and yes, there have indeed been more cases. But wonder of wonders, their case numbers have also dropped to around 10% of what they were when we arrived. That was in early December, and with zero restrictions, and no protests, and no Emergencies Act, or anything similar to use if there were, because everybody's happy. Our Emergencies Act authorizes its use by the federal government to take extraordinary temporary measures to respond to public welfare emergencies, public order emergencies, international emergencies, and war emergencies. It is clear that the recent protests were or are connected to the public welfare and to public order. But any thinking Canadian would certainly not place what we faced into the categories contemplated by the Emergencies Act. The exception is Justin Trudeau, whom in my opinion is trying to punch way above his weight in handling the office of Prime Minister. We need choice, and we don't have choice. Other parties must take notice, and they must speed up the job of getting their houses in order. What we have governing Canada now is simply not sustainable. I'm Peter Sherman. Find future episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts, or by visiting SHURMANUNLIMITED.com. So if you like what you heard, tell a friend. If you really liked it, tell 3 friends. If you really hated it, tell 3 enemies. We'll talk again soon.